I'm Zhou in Beijing. All in all, China is growing stronger and the Chinese are getting richer. But many problems remain unresolved. Is it possible to have both growth and fairness? Today, we will be looking at equality and justice.
And I'm Wang Mengmang. On the eve of the 12th National People's Congress session, we'll find out how the NPC's first spokeswoman dealt with some tough media questioning.
Hi, I am Terry-Ann Chebet in Nairobi. Now, the developing continent of Africa has seen some of the world's widest income gaps. We'll tell you how Africa is coping with the situation and what experiences it can share with China.
Well, the 12th National People's Congress has given a press conference at the Great Hall of the People in the Chinese capital ahead of its first session. NPC spokeswoman Fu Ying took questions on the agenda of this year's session and the work of the NPC. Our reporter Hona has been following this, and now let's talk to her. Well, Hona, this year's NPC session is especially important as we are expected to see a new lineup of leadership. So what was the biggest issue there?
Good evening, Mangmang. Well, we see the Vice Foreign Minister Fu Ying has made her debut as the NPC spokeswoman this morning. Well, that has actually surprised public because though she is the 7th NPC spokesperson, but she is the first NPC spokeswoman. Well, she has been answering questions ranging from various fields, and let's see how her diplomatic skills have helped her solving with questions regarding China's foreign policies.
The spokeswoman of the 12th NPC is no stranger to diplomacy. Vice Foreign Minister Fu Ying has also served as ambassador to Britain and Australia. No wonder she's confident when dealing with tough questions on foreign policy. A Japanese reporter asked whether China would continue to adopt what it calls a hard policy on territorial disputes. Fu Ying replied that in the eyes of many Chinese, the current policy is not hard enough.
When faced with provocations, many Chinese people think we should adopt a tougher stance. China always sticks to independent and peaceful diplomatic solutions. On the Diaoyu Islands dispute with Japan, I hope you can pass China's voice to Japanese people that we should stick to the historical facts.
Every year, reporters asked about the national defense budget. Fu Ying said China's peaceful foreign policy and defensive military policy are conducive to the security and peace of Asia.
A China with a stronger national defense will help maintain the peace in Asia as well as the world. China sticks to building a peaceful national defense. It is a defensive one. The building of the national defense in China is to protect itself, to protect safety, and is not a threat to other countries.
Another reporter asked whether environmental issues would be written into legislation. Fu Ying said she has the same concern. She said she wears a mask on smoggy days and makes sure her daughter wears one too.
First, more must be done in toughening up legislation on environmental protection. This includes amending and improving the atmospheric pollution prevention law and the environmental protection law. Secondly, more must be done to strengthen monitoring and enforcement. Thirdly, pragmatism is required. Environmental protection is one of the criteria by which the performance of governments at all levels will be evaluated.
Fu Ying also took questions on new anti-corruption measures and the number of seats available to migrant workers. In the coming days, she'll be back to brief the media on what lawmakers are doing.
Well, as you can see, Fu Ying always smiles as she talks, and that has left a really nice first impression to the public. People say that she's easygoing, down to earth, and pragmatic. She also introduced the proportion of the newly elected 12th NPC. She said this year there are more migrant workers, female NPC deputies, and also young generations. Among the 3,000 NPC deputies, 2 of them were born after 1990s, and 74 of them were born after 1980s. And also we see the number of female NPC deputies were up by 2%. And also we see fewer government officials accounting for only 35%. And that's a 6% drop compared with the 11th NPC, Mama.
Well, Hona, now let's spend some time talking about other issues that didn't have a chance to be addressed at the press conference. So you must have spoken to some other journalists from domestic media and from international media outlets. What were their major concerns?
Of course, Mama, there are many other questions. Well, actually, during the press conference, the economic issues were not mentioned, were not raised. But when I talked to many of the Western reporters, their biggest concerns are how China will maintain its economic growth at a relatively stable 8%. Well, remember last year's 18th Party Congress, the President Hu Jintao has set up the economic growth target for 2020. He said we should double the 2010 GDP and per capita income for both rural and urban residents by 2020, and that is the first time the per capita income has been included in the economic growth target. And many want to know what kind of new policies will be issued this time around. Well, also anti-corruption has been talked over and over again. We remember the General Secretary of CPC Central Committee, Xi Jinping, has said during his lineup in the 18th Party Congress, he said the corruption has to be dealt with. Failure to do so will prove fatal not only to the party but also to the country. Well, tomorrow we'll see the official opening of the 12th MPC. Well, there have been discussions about institutional restructuring before and after the 18th Party Congress, and the two sessions will be the time to give the final verdict. Back to you, Mama.
Well, thank you so much, Hona, for that, and we'll be checking with you in the coming days. All right, now let's talk more about Fu Ying. The spokeswoman Fu Ying has been voted into the spotlight, the first female spokesperson for MPC sessions over the past 3 decades. She comes from an ethnic minority born in Inner Mongolia, and she is described by some Western media as charming, steely, wary, and does not fit the stern face of most of Chinese officialdom. Well, Fu Ying has presented a more approachable air. For example, she apologized for being late because she was a newcomer to the Great Hall of the People and took more time in finding the correct way to the press briefing room. And also on environmental issues, she admitted that she has bought face masks for her daughter to tackle the heavy smog, and it's become her reflexive reaction every morning to see whether there is a blue sky. Well, Zhou, even before this MPC officially started, the spokesperson had already started taking tough questions from media, and she answered questions on sensitive issues such as defense policy, the territorial disputes, and the environment. And she just has this winning and confident smile on her all the time.
Yes, indeed. She's a very veteran diplomat and very natural, articulate, and also ready to take on the new challenges. Of course, there's a lot of catching up to do for her. Thank you, Mama.
You're welcome.
Well, joining me here in the studio to talk about all the issues on Voices and Votes, Mr. He Fan, Deputy Director of the Institute of World Economics and Politics at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and also Mr. Yao Yang, Dean of the China Center of Economic Research at Peking University. Welcome, gentlemen. Well, this is a very important meeting, the first MPC and CPPC session after the CPC's 18th Congress. So what do you think are the major highlights? What is the eye-catching issues for you? Mr. He.
Well, I think in the past, the main theme for China is the high economic growth. In the past, we have put much emphasis on the GDP number, the growth number. And now we are at a very crucial point. And now we are moving from this high growth to a better quality growth. And in this debate, I think social justice and the income distribution will become one of the most heated debated topic.
And for you, Mr. Yao?
Well, first, of course, we need to pay attention to the leadership transition. That's a big event, both conferences. And talk about the future, I think the environmental issue will be very high on the agenda, and the income distribution, and also I think population policy, and also financial sector reform. I think they are going to be mentioned by those delegates.
And there's one interesting thing that we should take notice is that for the first time, those people living in the countryside and in the cities will be equally represented at the nation's legislature. How important is that?
Well, because for quite a long time, we have this segment between the rural and the urban area, and this is becoming one of the major barriers for not only the social justice but also the sustainable economic growth. So now is the time that we address this issue. And I think this is the signal that shows that in the future there will be more reform concerning the hukou system and urbanization, and more reforms on the social safety network, the building of a social safety network.
So we have been talking about disparity between rural areas and urban areas. Does this policy signal anything of policy change in the future?
Well, this policy was announced actually last year. We changed our election law. But in terms of income disparity, I think the rural-urban divide is the largest in our country. It's very good to see that the new leadership is going to pay more attention to this issue. Urbanization is going to be very high on the agenda. That's going to be, in my own view, the only way out for China to solve the whole issue.
It seems that urbanization has become a vogue word for many government officials. What do you think the process of urbanization, where we are at right at the moment?
We are still at the midway, or we can say we are still at the very early stage, because previously, yes, we have this urbanization, but the much emphasis is on the urbanization of land. But as Li Keqiang mentioned, actually urbanization is about the population. So we are, in the future, we're moving more people from the rural area to the urban area.
And what is the major indicator that say, well, the urbanization is almost complete?
The most important indicator for urbanization will be the share of people living in the urban area to the whole population. But then a more tricky issue is how you count the people in the urbanization, because at the current statistics, we count people living in the urban area for a certain period of time, like more than half a year. So you'll be counted as the citizens in the urban area. But actually, a lot of them are migrant workers, so they are living in the urban area, but then they do not have equal chance to get the welfare.
So they are only city dwellers, but they are not urban residents, because they have no equal treatment, although they live in the cities.
Yeah, I think this is mostly because of the hukou system, right? The hukou divides people by, say, that they are local
household registration system.
Right, they are migrants, and if they are migrants, they cannot enjoy the privileges offered to those local people, like education, healthcare. You just mentioned all. And in Beijing, even housing. Right, so you have to live for 5 years to buy an apartment in Beijing. So all those kind of unequal treatments. That's what I think the new mode of urbanization is going to solve.
But do you think, did it make sense in the beginning of that system?
Well,
and does it still make sense now?
The system was introduced almost 60 years ago. I mean, in 1958. That was an extraordinary year. So it was almost a kind of an extraordinary policy introduced at that period of time. I mean, after 60 years, I don't think many people believe it's still necessary.
All right, you're now watching Voices and Votes, a special program on the nation's legislature and also political advisory body, our special coverage on the two sessions. Coming up next, just how serious is the wealth gap in China and how can it be tackled?
The CPPCC's various meetings are a platform for the CPPCC and its members to perform their political duties. During the meetings, CPPCC members make speeches, submit proposals, and vote on proposals. Away from the session for the rest of the year, members supervise the implementation of major national policies and oversee the planning and construction of large projects. They also closely monitor the actions of the government in dealing with major issues of public concern. CPPCC members work with the government's agenda and choose a special project to focus on. They raise opinions, interact with the public, evaluate the effectiveness of national policies, and feedback public concerns. The CPPCC plays a vital role in providing advice to the government, in democratic supervision, and in political consultation.
interviews and news. We cover a broad range of issues on the changing China during the annual political season in Beijing starting March the 3rd. Laws and policies are deliberated freely at the plenum of the NPC and CPPCC. Real representation from across the Chinese social spectrum. You can't miss it here only on Voices and Votes. A new era for China, a new leadership and new policies that will impact a quarter of the world population. Our reporters will bring you the latest as China faces the political, economic and diplomatic challenges that will help shape a generation. That is political season in 2013 with Han Bing, Ai Yang, Hou Na, Guan Xin and Zhang Yili. Only on CCTV News. Senior reporter back at the annual NPC and CPPCC sessions. Sharp questions. Headline-grabbing answers. China at a new era.
So when we are talking about inequality or disparity inside this country, there are many foes. Regional differences, also discipline differences, industrial differences. What is the major inequality that exists in this country?
There's overall inequality as measured by the famous indicator of Gini coefficient that describes the overall rich and the poor relation. But then by closer examination, you see the inequality of all kinds. And I agree with Professor Yao Yang. I think one of the main reasons for this widened income gap is between the urban and the rural area. But also you can find the inequality between the regions, like the coastal area and the inland area, and also between the villages. The larger gap probably will be the villages in the coastal area and the villages in the very remote backwater area.
Although it's all in the countryside, but it's totally different pictures.
Yeah, one is in the sky and one is...
Well, let's take up two pictures of the countryside life. And for that, we will be joined by our correspondents from both coastal and inland areas. China has accumulated a lot of wealth over the past few years. But how much of that can be shared by all its people? Is the distribution fair for all of them? Voices and Votes has chosen two places in this vast country to give you an idea. Well, the coastal province of Guangdong stands at the forefront of the country's reform and opening up. Income figures have suggested that both urban and rural residents there have been benefiting from the region's booming development. While in contrast, the inland Gansu province has registered a far less impressive growth. Residents there earn almost 50% less than those in Guangdong. And for a better understanding of those numbers and what is behind the numbers, let's talk to our reporters Liao Ruchen in Guangzhou, the capital of coastal Guangdong province, and Guanyang in Huining County in northwest Gansu province. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. Well, Ruchen, we know that Guangdong's economic boom has been regarded as a miracle by many people. It is no surprise that people there are leading a better life than elsewhere in the country. So what is actually behind this growth and what it means for the people there?
Right. Hello, Zhou Yue. By looking at the sheer size of Guangdong's GDP value, it is not hard to understand why it is considered a beacon of China's economy. The Guangdong's GDP value of 2012 is around $800 billion. That's approximately the same with South Korea, which ranked the 15th in all the countries of the world. And Guangdong is also the richest province in China and has kept the honor for 24 years. If we take a closer look at Guangdong's GDP, the proportion of the secondary and tertiary sector is relatively larger than most part of China. Therefore, the prosperity of the region is more directly reflected in the livelihood of the people. And the increasing spending ability of the customers is the key to the sustained development of the region. Zhou Yue.
All right, let me ask Guanyang then. The annual average disposable income there in your place, in Gansu, is around 17,000. and those in the countryside is even less, 4,500, half the number of Guangdong. So based on your observation, what exactly do these numbers say about the regional differences here in China?
Yes, first of all, Gansu is the birthplace of Chinese civilization as one of the country's key historical trade and cultural exchanges historically. But 30 years after the reform and opening up policies, the gap between rich and the poor have been gradually widened. As you are comparing the average disposable income between Guangdong and Gansu, the Gansu province is falling way behind. And this situation also applies to other provinces, municipalities and autonomous regions like Ningxia and Qinghai and so on. So in recent years, we have seen a great deal of calls for ending these worsening income disparities. This has been set to be the top priorities of the National People's Congress, and relevant proposals for reform, science and education have been brought by deputies to the Congress. But if you take one step back and look deep into the bottom of the problem, to look at the kind of lives people are living in, then we might just get the answer behind exactly what's the reason behind such poverty and the huge income gap, differences between rich and poor. Let's take a look at the following report. For some people, when they reach the age for retirement, there's usually a long list of exciting things to do. But for this elderly couple who have been farming all their lives, stopping work cuts off their main source of income.
We have a few adult cattle that took us almost 4 years to raise. At today's price, each is worth just over 5,000 yuan.
With a few days to go until the spring plowing season begins, this family sits down together for a late lunch. Boiled potatoes and a bowl of pickled cabbage is on the menu, a meal that hasn't changed for days. And household applicants are also years old and in need of repair.
This tape recorder is older than my youngest son. We bought it nearly 30 years ago and it's no longer functioning now. But these thermoses seem to be okay to use. We don't think we can afford to replace everything in this room.
The family is left wondering why they remain so poor after having put in decades of hard work.
We had some savings, about 10,000 yuan, but that was before I got colon cancer. That money was meant to be spent on refurbishing our house, but endless chemotherapies have taken away every penny we have. We even had to borrow money to cover the medical bills.
And at the end of our visit, Li Wei told us he won't be throwing away his farm tools anytime soon.
Jia Haixia was not born in Guangzhou. She's one of the tens of thousands of people who move to the booming city every year. And like many others, she has come to love this place.
I chose Guangdong rather than go to Beijing or Shanghai after I returned from the UK, mostly because of my husband. After years of working in Guangdong as a practice lawyer, I increasingly think I made the right decision at that time. Guangdong is a place with flourishing economy. It provided lots of opportunities. I think Guangdong is a good place for a person who has a dream to realize it.
These people seeking their dreams also bring energy to the city. Over the past decade, the city has changed in front of their very eyes. Whether it's the economy, the environment, traffic, or social infrastructure, the development of Guangzhou is in the fast lane.
When I settled in Guangdong in 2007, I was honored to join Guangdong Guangxin Law Firm. At that time, it was presented with a very golden opportunity. It became the sole and exclusive annual legal counsel of 2010 Asian Games Organizing Committee. Last year, we moved to here, Zhujiang New Town, the CBD center of Guangzhou. Recent years witnessed a very fast development of our business.
After work, Jia Haixia heads for home. She and her family have settled down and make this city their second hometown. Her baby is just a few months old, like all mothers, she wanted to give her the best. The economic boom is changing people's lives, bringing improvement not only on their income, but also lifestyle.
We have seen the area change. When we first bought this apartment, there was no highway or subway. Now it's much more convenient. The district is as beautiful as a park. We have all kinds of shopping centers, hospitals, and schools.
As the economy develops, Guangdong is stepping up to face the so-called middle-income trap. With more and more talented people like Jia Haixia coming to the city, this may be the fuel to keep Guangdong's economic growth. So, Ms. Jia Haixia, in our story, is just one of the examples of many people who started their dream in this city. Their hard work and their talent is the power that this city develops on, and it has also earned their fair share. The changes in their life is the living history of Guangdong's development. So in a sense, they grow up together with Guangdong. So yeah.
Well, these two stories pretty much tell the story. Although they live in the same country, they basically live in two different worlds. So my question goes to both of you. After spending days in these two different places and talking to the local people, tell us what stands out in your talk with them. How would you mark the job that the local government are doing to narrow the gap between different areas? Let me start with Guanyang.
Yes, Joe, in the report you saw that that is a typical rural family in the northwest that makes a living on farming something like 3 to 5 acres of land, and their savings usually come from by selling few cattle they've been feeding for years. But because the underdeveloped farming method, that their main source of income is heavily relied on the weather throughout the year. If there are frequent natural disasters, that their crops they produce can turn into nothing overnight. Another key element is the lack of the medical coverage, medical insurance. As you can see in the report, just one man in the family caught cancer, and this literally took away every single penny they have because his medical bills were not properly covered by the medical insurance. So if you add this thing together, then it's not hard to guess what's the real reason behind such poverty and the income difference between rich and poor. And so basically a more comprehensive health insurance which can allow more affordable access to medical treatment, as well as a thorough compensation scheme against disaster-triggered crop losses are the two things with the local farmers here concerned the most. And finally, during the time I was in Gansu province, I saw some good things. The local authorities and organizations are already helping the local farmers to extend their crop productions by offering interest-free loan, like by the Agricultural Bank of China here. So all these things can greatly reduce the poverty situation and the huge income gap between rich and poor. Back to you.
Yes, indeed. It's quite a different challenge for those better off areas like Guangdong. So what is your observation, Ruochen?
I noticed in my colleague Guanyang's story that it is mentioned that these people are hardworking, but they still live in poverty. And I think that's the key of the contrast. During my interview here, the word opportunity came up many times. I think that marks another characteristic of Guangdong's economy. Over the years, many companies and partners have naturally come together, forming clusters of companies in similar business. For example, if you decide to start a trouser factory, you can easily find suppliers of zips, buttons, tags, and cloths and all colors of dyes. So it is easier for those self-made persons who started their own career to succeed. And this in turn has attracted more high-quality, talented people. And this is especially important since we mentioned that Guangdong is entering the middle-income trap. That's a stage where a developing economy can no longer compete with the low-cost manufacturers, and it's feeling the pressure to become an advanced economy in highly skilled innovations. So the talented people are the key to the sustained development of Guangdong, and it's the key to keeping the vitality of this place. So yeah.
Well, it is a challenge for both to move up the ladder of success and value. Thank you very much, Ruochen, and also our reporter Guanyang in Gansu province. Well, when we talk about inequality, there is a definition of how unequal it is, the urgency of speeding up reform to improve China's income distribution is highlighted by the so-called Gini coefficient, a measure of countries' income and wealth inequality. It is very simple math. A 0 reflects complete equality, and 1 points to complete inequality. So every country gets a decimal rating. Well, the Gini is well and truly out of the bottle. China's Gini coefficient reached 0.491 in 2008, the highest during the past decade. It dropped slightly to 0.48 in 2010 and again to 0.47 in 2011 and 2012. But all those figures are higher than the alarm warning level of 0.4 set by the UN. The average disposable income of urban residents in 2012 was roughly 24,565 yuan. That's 3 times the average net income of those living in the countryside. Well, a recent online survey by CCTV News has been asking people all over to give their views on the social inequality in China. So what is their sense of this country's inequality? For that, let's turn to my colleague Mama. Mama.
Well, Zhou, exactly. We've been trying to get opinions from people on what they think can be done to really narrow this gap, this wealth gap and the income gap. And now let's break down their opinions. Most people say that the government should improve social security and welfare provision. Around 33% believe income distribution reforms are urgently needed. And 12% of those surveyed said they would support reforms to China's income tax system. And another 10% think the hukou, or as we earlier mentioned in the studio discussion, that's the family registration system, must be reformed, along with measures to guarantee equal employment opportunities for both urban and rural workers. And so there have been a lot of talks about this income inequality. And I think that in order to improve that situation, what the government can do is to improve people's equal access to resources and to opportunities.
We know that those pledges and promises can mean anything if they're not implemented. There are still a lot of people worrying about those social problems unresolved. What do netizens say about those very scary, or should I say very conflicting social problems that we have?
And these social problems can be really alarming. Well, there's a lot of talk about the gap between the rich and poor, so let's now take a closer look at what people are saying about this. And this netizen Wei Zhengyu says hundreds and thousands of people are living below the poverty line, and that urban residents have much better education and medical services than those in rural areas. And another microblogger says that he highlights the rich and poor gap, but he also links it to the gaps between the urban and rural residents, state-owned and private companies, and salaried and temporary workers. And he also adds that slogans are meaningless without implementation. Other netizens have offered their own suggestions. Microblogger Ao Bali says that to narrow the gap between the rich and poor, the government should reform the primary distribution system and break the existing monopoly of large state-owned enterprises. And he says these companies monopolize important resources such as transport, energy, and communication. And he's calling for greater competition in these areas. That's what I have, Zhou.
Well, of course, different people have different understanding and also approaches to how to solve those problems, especially the problem of inequality here in China. And let's turn to our panels for a discussion on that. What do you think is the fundamental problem, or fundamental reason behind inequality in this country? Who is to blame for this widening gap between the rich and the poor?
Well, I think mainly it's because of the traditional growth model that we are so familiar with in the past 1 or 2 decades. Because in the past, the engine for growth is globalization. But by globalization, and you can see that the coastal area, then they will mainly benefit from globalization. They are closer to the overseas market, and then a lot of the labor and the capital flow from the western area to the coastal area, and then the western area was left behind. That's one of the main reasons.
So what can we expect the government to do to narrow the gap, or it is the government's responsibility or not?
We have to change the course. We have to change the model. So now the government is emphasized that we should rely more on domestic demand by creating more domestic demand. so we can have a more balanced growth between the coastal and the inland area.
If we have to boost the domestic demand so that we can rely on our own economy manufacturing rather than export, what exactly should the industrial restructuring to do? Shall we just forget our export-led economy?
No, the manufacturer in the export sector, they are climbing up the ladder because now they are facing the continually increasing labor cost. So they are now investing more and more on capital goods. They try to replace the workers by the equipment. And that in the future, there will be less and less demand for those unskilled labor. That will become a serious problem.
Mr. Yao, what do you think?
Well, I think first we have to realize that it could be a natural process. There is one economist whose name is Kuznets. He found this so-called Kuznets curve. That is, when your income level goes up, usually you find out inequality goes up too, up to a point that...
Why is that? What is the reasoning?
Well, the reason is that when your economy is growing, then people become quite diversified. And then the market is going to reward the talents. And we know the distribution of talents is not even among the population. But then after one point, then people whose education is more uniformly improved, then you can see the income inequality drops. So to some extent, it's a natural process. But that has been said, also the government policy in China can play a role to worsen income distribution. For example, the government invests very heavily into infrastructure, into industrial parks. To some extent, it's a subsidy to producers. And then if you look at our data, you can see the share of labor income has been dropping quite dramatically in the last 15 years. So it has a lot to do with government promotion of that kind of industry.
So you're saying those people sitting on the top will become richer and those sitting at the bottom will become poorer because this is a natural process?
Yeah, to some extent that's a natural process. But in China's case, we really don't know how much can be contributed to this natural process, and how much can be contributed to other things like government policies.
So the conventional wisdom is that this time the government should kick in and through taxation or social program spending to narrow the gap. Should the government take on more responsibilities?
I would say yes. I think that the government should pay more attention to what we call the second time distribution. Not much so to it's going to interfere into the working of the market. But since the government has a lot of taxes, the government can spend the money in the right direction. In my opinion, it might be spending more to improve people's income capability. For example, people's education level. That can be very crucial, not just for today, but for the future, next 20 years. Like He Fan said, we have been seeing this replacement of machine, of those people by machine. Then in the future, those people are going to lose their job.
So strategic speaking, those investment in education and infrastructure should give those people a better chance of having better equality.
Yeah, one reason why people are so nervous about this inequality, I think not because the inequality of the income per se, but because the inequality of opportunity. So we should increase the social mobility. And one of the most important work that we should do to improve this social mobility is by education.
And what is your assessment of the current social mobility level here in China?
I think it's getting worse compared with before. In the past, for example, if you are born in the rural area and still you have chance, you can join the army and you can go to the university and the college and then climb up the ladder. But now if you are the children of the migrant worker, most of them will become the second generation of migrant worker.
But in a perfect market economy, isn't it that everybody should have a fair chance and a fair shot?
Well, that's the reason, because we do not have a perfect market economy. So we should continue this market-oriented reform to let the market have a better function. And at the same time, we should have this government to provide the social safety network, making people feel more assured for the future, less anxious about their future.
If this problem, the widening income gap, continues or even worsens, could it be a big problem for China's economy? In what way?
It will become a problem for the economic growth because it will disencourage consumption, and also it will disencourage people to work harder because they will think, even I work harder, I have less chance to improve my life. And also it will be a problem for social stability because with this increasing social discontent, you can see there will be more tension between the rich and the poor.
So how worried should we be worrying about social problems because of inequality in different areas, in different classes?
I think today we are still on the kind of rising side. People's income is still growing, and those people in the countryside, especially young people, are moving into the city. They can improve their life quite easily to some extent because there is a kind of a shortage of labor in China. But we cannot guarantee in, say, 10 years' time or 20 years' time, we still need so many unskilled workers. So to me, I have to add to He Fan's argument, the future risk is that if we don't improve income inequality today, then we're going to face the problem of the lack of education on the part of those workers, right? Because now education is quite expensive for those people at the lower end. Then they're not going to get the proper education. Today, there is no problem, but in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, there will be a huge problem for China, not just because economic growth is going to slow down, and also we are going to face a huge social problem.
Do you agree it could be a ticking bomb because of China's changing economic structure and probably slowing down economy?
Yeah, we still have a window of opportunity, but then this window will close very soon. So now is the right time that we tackle with this.
How soon will that be?
It's getting worse because now we have all the problems, the increasing of labor cost and also the aging problem, and also because the sluggish of external demand. So all the factors combining together, and I think now we may have another 5 years for reform, and before that I do not have confidence.
So that's why it is a very pressing issue for this country and the new administration. In this political season, many pressing social issues will be on the table for debate by the legislators and the government. Better and fairer income distribution is, of course, one of them. As policymakers talk the talk, many people are hoping the rhetoric will lead to some real changes on the ground. Our reporter Ai Yang brings us this story.
China's top political advisors making their way to the most important conference in Beijing. Meanwhile, many of the capital's less privileged population are striving for a better life.
But the living costs are really high here. For a migrant worker like me, getting a house and car is impossible for me. So I want to save as much as I can and hope one day I can bring my wife and daughter to live here too.
33-year-old Bai Fei rents a small basement room. He's just one of millions of low-income urban residents. It seems China's fast development is leaving them behind. Last year, China's Gini coefficient, an index used to indicate a country's wealth gap, reached 0.474, higher than the 0.4 warning level set by the United Nations. Some CPPCC members say not enough is being done.
I'm very concerned about income distribution reforms. The overall guidelines are quite general. It is necessary to have a broad view from the top down, but there also needs to be more specific changes, so the reforms don't become superficial.
The reform guidelines issued by the State Council in January say the government will work to double the average real income of urban and rural residents by 2020 from the 2010 levels. But it admits that the project is systematic and complicated and will require a reallocation of various interests.
I think income redistribution must first consider regional disparity. The income gap between underdeveloped central and western regions and the richer eastern and coastal regions must be narrowed first, especially concerning migrant workers. They are a big force in the cities now, and their interests must be carefully considered for a more balanced society.
For political advisors, rhetoric comes easy. But for people like Bai Fei, these suggestions could be life-changing if they get carried out. This political season under China's new leadership will undoubtedly see a great many topics debated, but for ordinary people, the income distribution hits the most close to home. It is the pressing hope of many that members and deputies of the two sessions will give a further push to this reform. Ai Yang, CCTV, Beijing.
Well, China has its long-awaited income distribution reform plan. It is now under heated debate. Although people are considerably better off than when China began its economic reforms back in 1978, there are still clear disparities. Income in cities have risen far faster than in rural areas. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences reports that the gap between rural and urban incomes has spiraled up 68% since 1985, leading to one of the widest wealth gaps in Asia. So how important is this income distribution reform for this country? Where lies the biggest hurdle? What efforts will the new leaders take the stage when they are facing these problems? My colleague Tian Wei spoke to NPC Deputy Cai Fang, who is one of the Presidium members.
Mr. Cai, welcome to CCTV News.
Thank you.
As a prominent Chinese scholar, I'm sure you have a lot of views and opinions about the upcoming income distribution reform in China. It's very much under debate right now.
There are two kinds of income sources. One is labor income. That is, if there is any income inequality, that is the difference in wages among people. Generally speaking, this part of inequality has been declining gradually. For example, the Gini coefficient was 0.49 in 2008, but now is already smaller, that is 0.47. But the most important part of income, which generates the biggest inequality, is the part in which people have different assets to the resources, assets. For example, in the process of land development.
But what kind of a time frame are you looking at when it comes to income distribution reform in this country?
Okay, if we take time frame, we should say 2020 is the goal for the well-being society construction. First of all, you see the labor market institution construction is underway. That is, in this labor income distribution part, we are making progress already. And also, if you look at the Central Committee and the State Council's document about income distribution reform, you can have the list on each different agenda and timetable and roadmap.
And do you think the vested interest will be eventually surrender to the overall picture?
No, they will not surrender. But anyway, the leaders, some of the leaders in this vested interest group are also cadres under the same system. So if some people do not do right thing, they can be replaced. Even during this People's Congress, we will discuss and implement the reform of the government organization.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much. All the best.
Well, Mr. Tsai mentioned that despite the opposition from some of the vested interest groups, the Chinese government is still sticking to the plan of those, what we call income redistribution plan. But what is actually this income redistribution plan? Is it just a bunch of philosophies and principles, or do we have a clear roadmap here on the table?
We have already done some reform on income distribution. For example, we started to increase the minimum wage of those unskilled labor, and also we started to provide some basic welfare for those like the retirees in the urban area, and also the farmers in the rural area. And we started to introduce some like inheritance tax for the rich people, and also put a ceiling for the excessively high wage of those senior managers of those monopoly industries. So this is one way that we can reform the income distribution system. But more important is we need to increase the increase the supply of those public service, public education, and public schooling, to create a more equal opportunity for both.
So this is basically still a wealth redistribution. We take some of the money from those wealthy to subsidize those who are living a not so rich life. Is that so?
Well, this is everywhere, right? If you want to correct the income distribution, then you have to do some redistribution of income. So that's everywhere, not just in China. But I would like to add that we have to be very careful when we think about how to do this. One way to do this is just for the government to get into the market and give order to those enterprises and say you have to pay this, you have to pay that.
We can raise the tax on those businesses.
Right. Or another way is that you don't interfere into the market, but instead you do a careful redistribution plan, like He Fan said. We can do more in education, in public services. Right? So those are two different kind of approaches.
But do we need to do both at the same time? Because on one hand you need revenue, on the other hand you need to increase spending.
Well, I think that the first approach is going to be not as good as the second one, because when you go to the market and order enterprises to pay a certain amount of salaries to certain people, I don't think that's a good idea. Or you put a ceiling to some people's salaries, that's not going to be a very good idea. It's much better to increase people's income capability. Right? In the end, we have to increase the pie instead of just look at the current pie and say, I want to have a larger share.
So, this is a very philosophical question. Which is more important, to increase the size of the pie, or we have a more equitable cutting of the pie?
Well, I think now we should do both. Previously, we encourage some people to get rich first, and then we have the assumption that if some people get rich first, and then it will lead all the people to get rich at the same time. But it is true.
But the problem is some people are getting rich too fast and, too much.
Yeah. So now I think we should do both. On the one hand, we should use the taxation system, and then to have a better redistribution of the income. But still at the same time, we need to maintain a relatively higher growth rate, because a lot of problem in China, we need to be growth out. You cannot just stop the economic growth and then start this redistribution, and then you start the engine again. but we should do it both.
But people are now worried that China's economy has been slowing down. This year, probably 7.5% GDP growth. But on the other hand, the party has been saying that the goal of doubling China's GDP and per capita income by the year 2020, is that realistic?
That's realistic. The reason why we set a target for this year's growth number at 7.5%, I think because the government have a calculation that if you can maintain your growth rate above 7.5%, and then the unemployment ratio will be lower than 5%, and this is the threshold. If it's lower than 5%, and then we can be confident that there's no serious problem of social instability. So you can see that the concern of the government is not high growth anymore. It's mainly the first goal is job creation, and the job creation, if you can create more job, and then you can pave the way for the long-term growth, and then you can help to reduce this income gap, and also you can continue.
But the problem is, are those jobs well-paying jobs? Are people getting double income? Can that be realized?
But actually, doubling the income is a very easy task for China. It says we are going to double the income of 2010 by 2020. So in 10 years' time, we are going to do that. And a simple calculation.
With the inflation adjusted.
Yeah, but the simple calculation will show you, as long as we can keep a 7% growth rate, we are going to do that in 10 years. So that's a very easy task. Or in other words, it's a very conservative task. I think we are going to be more than
we'll
more than
overachieve on that.
Yeah, right. But the problem is that this is just the average. We really don't know whether those people at the really lower end can double their income. That's a real question.
So that's an average figure. That doesn't mean those people living below the poverty line will have their income doubled.
Yeah, right.
So how can we make sure that also happens when we improve the average number?
Well, as He Fan said, we have to continue to create more jobs, especially urban jobs. If you leave those people in the countryside, it's going to be quite challenging to double their income.
And what kind of jobs are we looking at by saying that we will be ensuring that still 10 million people can be employed every year?
In 1990s and the early 21st century, the main source for job creation is in manufacturing sector.
Still in manufacturing.
But now in the future there will be less job which can be created by the manufacturing sector. So now we have to encourage the development of the service sector, because in the future service sector can absorb more labor force. And it can solve both the unskilled labor, which transferred from the manufacturing sector, and also it can create more job for those have well education. The students graduated from university and the college. They will not work in the factory. They will work in the research and the development, education, healthcare, and finance, insurance, whatever.
But with the income doubled by those employed by the manufacturing business, will it pose a danger of China losing its edge of competitiveness?
As the manufacturing sector is now investing more and more research and development, and they are investing in, even Foxconn is now investing in robot. So I assume that in the future the manufacturing sector in China will climb up the ladder and will increase their competitiveness. Well, if by higher standard like the labor cost and environmental standard, some less competitive companies will just disappear. But what remains in the market will be more competitive.
And so the service industry will make up for the room that lost to the manufacturing.
Hope so, yeah. But then there should be the government to bridge this transformation.
All right. You're now watching our special program, Voices and Votes. Coming up next, is there anything China can learn from the rest of the world about bringing the widening gap between the rich and poor? Stay tuned. Well, actually, China is not the only country in the world struggling with inequality. Western advanced countries experienced dramatic expansion of the middle class in the 20th century, but they are now struggling to sustain that momentum. Some say the U.S. has begun recovering from the financial crisis, while others may argue not yet. But obviously, the gap between the country's wealthiest and the poorest has widened. The 99% and the 1% has divided the country. Our U.S. correspondent Daniel Ringus joins us now from Washington. Hello, Daniel.
Thank you. As this nation undertakes its biggest public consolidation of finances in a generation, there's a danger of a section of that population simply getting left behind.
Skid Row in Los Angeles is emblematic of the social, economic and psychological struggles faced by some of America's most destitute. Among the drugs, guns and prostitution here, there are families with children living in this homeless shelter, washed up by the burden of debt and unemployment.
We lost our house due to money issues, and after that we had nowhere to go. And in the beginning it was overwhelming. I cried because it's like it's just different, and you know, you wake up one day and you're home, and then it's all of a sudden you don't have nothing.
Data collected by the 2011 US Census suggests the gap between the nation's wealthiest and poorest has increased in the last few years.
During the recession, everyone lost wealth. Whether you were rich or poor, there was a sharp drop in your wealth. However, there was less of a drop in wealth at the top compared to the bottom. So the divide between the rich and the poor did get wider during the recession.
The divide is more acute among Hispanic and African American groups who've seen their job opportunities diminish. Those who came out worst invested the majority of their income into housing in areas which suffered the worst price drops. On a broader scale, the Congressional Budget Office has concluded that the top 1% of households increased their wealth by about 275% between 1979 and 2007, while the bottom 20% increased only by 18%.
So this trend towards wider wealth disparities has only been made worse by the financial crisis. Back to you.
And Daniel, you've been talking about inequality over there in the U.S., and that also has something to do with minority issues. Has the alarm been ringing loud enough for the government? What do the policymakers say and do about it?
Well, the thing with poverty and tackling those issues is that it encompasses a broad range of different policy areas. So you have education, access to education, you have healthcare, you have nutrition, you have housing, and all of those different things wrapped up together. And immigration is certainly one of the areas where people find it difficult to get up a rung on the ladder. But there are many challenges. Let me give you one example. President Obama tried to implement universal health care coverage during his first term, but the businesses and many Republicans kicked back and watered down the proposals such that we still have somewhere around 45 million Americans who are uninsured, about 15% of the population at least uninsured. So new reforms are coming in, but there's still a question mark about whether some of the poorest have access to healthcare and will do in the future, and that is a major aspect of the degradation of the standard of living amongst the poorest amongst us.
So different people have different ideas where the problem is. You're suggesting that the political gridlock is in the way of seriously tackling this problem, and those people who are struggling can only wait out the messy political process?
Well, in the context of the fact that everybody is looking at their budgets and ways to tighten it, it makes policy makers and practitioners trying to tackle the issue of poverty a very challenging issue, made worse, I think, by the political polarization that I've been referring to here. But there is potentially a way forward here, and that is the idea of the American dream itself is one in which everybody has a shot at wealth, everybody has a shot at the middle class. And so, though Democrats have touted social welfare much more than Republicans saying you've got to go it alone, you've got to let the market take take its place. Nonetheless, there are issues about access to things like education, particularly in the Republican case for the Latino communities, because that's an area that's growing demographically. They are going to have to grasp that if they want to get elected again. So there has to be an issue of equal opportunity, and maybe that's a way in which politicians can align from the left and the right to create that equality of opportunity going forward.
But finally, still makes political sense here in the U.S. Thank you very much, Daniel, for your reporting. Well, the problem of income gaps in developing nations may be more striking because it could easily threaten the fragile social stability and economic development. And for an African perspective, let's talk to my colleague, Tarian Chebet in Nairobi. Hello there. Tarian?
Yes, please.
Well, we know, Tarian, a few more questions before we let you go.
Thank you very much,
yes.
Zoe. Now, of course, the situation in sub-Saharan Africa is the same or pretty much worse in terms of the widening gap between the rich and the poor. And we'll just start off with a story out of South Africa, where the wealth gap is a continuous source of concern to researchers and governments. In South Africa, the gap as measured by the Gini coefficient in 2011 is at 0.63, just coming off a high of 0.68 between 2002 and 2005. Now, this makes South Africa one of the most unequal countries in the world, ranked alongside Namibia. CCTV's Angelo Coppola explores the reality behind the statistics.
While optimists would point to the improvement as proof that the government has made great strides in addressing this economic inequality, much of the progress is due to the social grant system. The South African Institute of Race Relations has done extensive research into the subject and its solutions.
Well, what we have actually had a lot of success in is bettering people's living standards. So if we look at LSM categories, which is living standards measure categories, what we've seen is that there has been a migration from the lowest category or the poorest categories into the middle categories. So 10 years ago, 11% of South Africa's population was sitting in LSM category 1, so the poorest category, and that's decreased to 1% over the last decade.
While this is good news, the major reason for the change in data is due to the social grant system in the country, which, according to Alexander, now sees more than 15 million beneficiaries receiving those grants. She says something has to change.
There are two main things that need to happen. The first is to create jobs, which will have an impact on unemployment. And in order to do that, the economy is going to have to grow. So, and the second thing that actually needs to take place is that education system needs to be sorted out, because people are coming out of the education system without the necessary skills to enable them to get into the job market, and that's a massive problem.
As one of the most unequal countries in the world, Mike Haywood from non-governmental organization Section 27 says that education is absolutely critical to changing this situation.
Once the people who come from South Africa's rural areas, from South Africa's disadvantaged townships, can compete in the economy, then you're going to get the beginnings of some redistribution of wealth to black people and redistribution of wealth out of kind of big urban centers into more rural, more peri-urban.
It's not been an easy road for Alexander resident Thabo Ngobese, who is one of the 24.9% of the unemployed population. He is making the best of a bad situation and has resigned himself to his new reality by becoming an entrepreneur, earning just $12 a day and keeping himself honest.
That is enough for me for survive. And then you stop there anything to stealing somebody and just doing myself. Then they give me something, they buy something for food.
While Thabo may not benefit immediately, Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan says that allocations for employment programs will increase by 13.5% a year over the next 3 years. For people living in the shadows of this growing metropolis, perception is reality, and so is the wealth gap. Residents here travel into Sandton either to work or to look for work. I'm Angelo Coppola for CCTV in Johannesburg.
Now, a recent report by the World Bank says inequality has returned to the center of the development agenda in the post-crisis world. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the gap between the rich and the poor continues to expand. There is some positive news, though. Let's look at some of these figures. In 1981, 75% of citizens in the developing world lived on less than $2 a day. Now that has, however, dramatically dropped and today stands at just about 43%. Now let's also look at some of this staggering news, the world's most unequal countries, and as we can see here, about 5 of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. We have Namibia, South Africa, Lesotho, Botswana, as well as Sierra Leone. Now let's also take a quick look at the South African situation, which is Africa's largest economy, where despite the gains in economic growth, the country still has one of the world's most unequal income distributions. Take a look at these figures coming out of South Africa, where the richest 10% of the population and 60% of the national income. Now, if you look at the flip side, where we have about 55% of the population earns only 8% of the national income. Now, research carried out by NGO Oxfam shows that because it is so unequal in South Africa, even with sustained economic growth, about 1 million more people will be pushed into extreme poverty by 2020. That's unless action is not taken. The same figures are replicated across several countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, analysts say the gap, that's of course a widening gap between the rich and the poor in sub-Saharan Africa, has some far-reaching implications. They're economically inefficient. They have threatened political stability, as we have seen in South Africa and Nigeria in the past, and they are also socially divisive. Now, what can be done to solve that particular inequality situation? Let's look at some possible solutions. Now, they range from equitable distribution of resources, increasing minimum wages, as we have seen in South Africa just earlier this year, more investment in education. We've seen countries such as Kenya introduce free primary education, reforms where youth employment is concerned. About 50% of African youth are unemployed. Smallholder farming, we've seen countries in sub-Saharan Africa such as Rwanda introduce some reforms to encourage smallholder farming, investment in technology, as well as sustained governance. Now, it is widely acknowledged that many African economies are growing faster than those of almost any other region in the world. However, the current pattern of growth has not trickled down to most people, and it is time that leaders rethink the model to narrow the income gap. Now, from the African situation, let's head off to Asia, where although India has become one of the fastest growing economies in the world, its biggest problem remains lack of inclusiveness in its growth. The gap between the rich and the poor in the country is growing, many times leading to internal struggles. Last year saw India's inflation rise sharply, posing the biggest challenge to reducing the rich and the poor gap and achieving the Indian government's goal of an inclusive growth. Here's more from our India correspondent, Shweta Bajaj.
Here in the Indian capital, you can see signs of India's growing economy and infrastructure on one side. And the other side, there are slums. Economic inequality and the rich-poor divide is something which is visible starkly and stares at your eyes in India. In the last year, though, the biggest trouble has become that how do these people feed their families? India's economic growth is at its lowest, and that's also a reason why the Indian government cannot dole out the same sops it doled out for the poor about a year back. Last year has seen the Indian government cutting on subsidies that have led to increase in prices of cooking gas and fuel, which have impacted the poor the most. Much of India's money goes into schemes for poor, including subsidies in food and fertilizer. But most of this does not reach the people it's meant to be because of a lack of an efficient delivery system. A lot of it also gets lost in corruption. According to Indian government's economic survey for the financial year 2012-2013, poverty has gone down in India by about average rate of 1.5% since the last 9 years, since the current government has been in power. But there is no mention about the rich and poor divide, which has only become wider. The Indian government's economic survey also says that the reason why poverty has gone down by about roughly 54.2 million people, the reason for it is high economic growth and the Indian government's social security measures and schemes. The central government's expenditure on social security schemes and rural development has gone up by 14.77%, showing that the government is giving a high priority to this area. The 11th plan of India saw a massive increase of 149% for social security schemes, but the rich-poor divide remains stark as Indian government has been unsuccessful in plugging loopholes in the delivery mechanism. Just like China's latest measures to reduce the rich-poor divide, India too recently announced steps to introduce direct cash transfers in an effort to get the money directly to people it's intended for. But problems in India remain basic, that most of rural India doesn't have banks and poor people do not have bank accounts, which means delivery will continue to be a very mean task. As far as the Indian government is concerned, their line has been inclusive growth, but the inclusiveness has been elusive and the problem will continue and the rich and poor divide will continue to grow till the time inflation is tamed. Shweta Bajaj, CCTV, New Delhi.
That's our CCTV correspondent in India, Shweta Bajaj, giving us an overview of the widening income gaps in India and a few steps the government is taking to combat inequality. Zoyue, back to you in studio in Beijing.
Well, Terry, in terms of what's behind the widening income gap in Africa, what is the universal thing and what is unique in Africa? Terry?
Zoe, there are a number of universal causes of widening income gaps, especially lack of government policies that ensure equitable distribution of national resources, poor educational levels, as I mentioned in the report earlier, corruption also, which is said to hurt the poor more than it does hurt the rich. Now, high government debts, as we see in most developing nations, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, also put a strain to the ability of governments to spend more on socio-economic policies. Now, those causes, of course, universal and can fit in most economies facing the same challenges. A unique case, however, is South Africa, due to its history of racial inequality under the apartheid regime. That's between 1948 and 1994. One of the main reasons, of course, why South Africa has the highest income inequality in the world. Zoe, we're back to you.
And Terry, another question. China has made a lot of efforts to bridge the income gap, but despite a lot of challenges and problems to be resolved, how do Africans look at China's track record?
A number of reports that talk about China and Africa show that the Chinese have put more emphasis on equality of opportunity, a strategy that seems to be working there, and perhaps a key lesson that the continent can learn from China. Now, we've seen countries here like Rwanda adopting policies such as one cow per poor home program, where the government gives each poor home a cow in order to boost domestic revenue streams. Now, this is just one example of government policies and reforms that some countries are putting in place to reduce the income gap. Other examples of what the continent can pick up from models such as China is the remodeling of the distribution resources through tax and, of course, the benefiting systems, as well as low-income housing. Zoe, we're back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Tarian Shibay, reporting from Nairobi. Well, let's come out to our studio discussions here. Well, we have been looking at the U.S. and Africa and India. They also have inequality problems. But China shares some of the problems, but the other problems are unique here in China. What are those things that you think we share, and what are things that stand out as our own?
The unique thing, I think, probably will be the hukou system. That's quite unique.
Like the racial problem in Africa.
Yeah, and also the racial problem in the United States. Yeah. So, but the lessons that we can learn, some of the lessons we haven't have this problem, but we should. It rings the alarming bell for China. So we should keep a close eye in the future. I think at least three. One is the poor management of urbanization, the ghetto and the slum we already saw. in many third world countries. That's like the cancer of urbanization in the developing countries. And second is the populist policy. You promise too much for the people. They get excited at first, but
they cannot deliver on those promises.
But become more disappointed at the end of the day. And third is the rampant corruption in some developing countries. So these are the issues that we should take the lesson from other countries.
What about the United States? Because the United States, as our reporter said, actually political infighting is the major problem of carrying out some of the reform of bringing equality in that country.
Well, inequality is a worldwide phenomenon. I think in the U.S. It has something to do with globalization. Right. So in the end, to solve this problem, I think the United States has to do something to improve the education of those people. I mean, the United States has to keep being the world leader of technology, and to do that, the United States has to provide proper or higher education to its people.
Let's come back to China. Many people are saying that China is at the threshold of getting trapped into a middle income trap. What exactly is that term? Why is that a problem?
Well, there's an interesting article in the magazine Economist. It's argued that the concept of middle income trap is not defined clearly enough to be tested. Barry Eichengreen, an economist from Berkeley, and his colleague has done some research on this topic, and they found some case for a fast-growing economy suddenly slow down. But they cannot prove that this is the fate for all the country because
that does not necessarily happen everywhere.
Yeah, because on average, as a group, middle-income countries grows faster than both advanced country and those less developed country.
So what are those examples that have overcome that trap?
Well, some examples like our neighboring countries, Korea and Japan, maybe in the 1960s and 70s, and Singapore and some other countries. I think all have very good examples.
But we have different economic structures and economic size. Will that experience apply to us? Do you think we will also follow that path of continued sustainable growth?
There are some in common for those countries, challenges we all facing, like the aging problem, but we share some similarities because we have the same growth model. But then look at the case in Japan and Korea. When they come to a certain stage, they have to increase their competitiveness, so move up the ladder from producing the low-ended products to spend more money on research and development and climb up the ladder.
So is it the case that when our economy become more advanced, it will naturally solve the problem, or it will solve the problem of income inequality in a sense?
Well, if you look around the world, those countries or regions that have successfully moved up the ladder to become high-income countries or regions, they have all maintained quite equal income distribution, whereas those countries that have been stuck in the middle income level are all those unequal countries. So that tells us something. I don't know if there is a kind of a firm causality, but there must be something behind that. So in that sense, to improve income inequality today will provide a kind of a larger chance for us to move up to a high-income country.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Yao, and thank you very much, Mr. He. And before we go, let's check out some very interesting moments and pictures that we have during this day of the National Congress and CPPCC. Mama.
Well, Zhou, we've spent so much time talking about pressing and alarming issues at the two political sessions. Now, let's take a look at some pictures, some light-hearted pictures. All right, of course, as you can see here, color is definitely the key word at the two political sessions when it comes to delegates from China's different ethnic groups. Traditional outfits have become more and more popular for people attending these meetings, and every year they attract quite a lot of media attention. And the costumes help to reinforce identity and send a visual message of a person's culture and background. They also highlight the diversity of representation with China's political system. Well, Zouye, who says it's only dark-suited men and women at the Great Hall of the People? We are seeing plenty of colors there.
But on the other hand, there is no fairness in everything. In terms of costume and outfit, the females always win out in terms of color and pattern.
You can't complain about that.
Yes, we cannot argue against this. Thank you very much, Mamong, for your reporting on that. Well, both government and market failures could lead to inequality among the people. But it's the government's job to bring about prosperity without failing the people of fairness. And it takes political will to strike a balance. And we'd like to remind you, we want to hear your opinions and views. You can also watch our film of China Dream at Sina Weibo at CCTV News. I'm Zhou in Beijing. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.
China sticks to building a peaceful national defense. It is a defensive one. The building of the national defense in China is to protect itself, to protect safety, and is not a threat to other countries.
Another reporter asked whether environmental issues will be written into legislation. Fu Ying said she has the same concern. She said she wears a mask on smoggy days and makes sure her daughter wears one too.
First, more must be done in toughening up legislation on environmental protection. This includes amending and improving the atmospheric pollution prevention law and the environmental protection law. Secondly, more must be done to strengthen monitoring and enforcement. Thirdly, pragmatism is required. Environmental protection is one of the criteria by which the performance of governments at all levels will be evaluated.
Fu Ying also took questions on new anti-corruption measures and the number of seats available to migrant workers. In the coming days, she'll be back to brief the media on what lawmakers are doing.
Well, as you can see, Fu Ying always smiles as she talks, and that has left a really nice first impression to the public. People say that she's easygoing, down to earth, and pragmatic. She also introduced the proportion of the newly elected 12th NPC. She said this year there are more migrant workers, female NPC deputies, and also young generations. Among the 3,000 NPC deputies, 2 of them were born after 1990s, and 74 of them were born after 1980s. And also we see the number of female NPC deputies were up by 2%. And also we see fewer government officials accounting for only 35%. And that's a 6% drop compared with the 11th NPC. Mama. Well, Hona, now let's spend some time talking about other issues that didn't have a chance to be addressed at the press conference. So you must have spoken to some other journalists from domestic media and from international media outlets. What were their major concerns? Of course, Mama, there are many other questions. Well, actually, during the press conference, the economic issues were not mentioned, were not raised. But when I talked to many of the Western reporters, their biggest concerns are how China will maintain its economic growth at a relatively stable 8%. We remember last year's 18th Party Congress, the President Hu Jintao has set up the economic growth target for 2020. He said we should double the 2010 GDP and per capita income for both rural and urban residents by 2020, and that is the first time the per capita income has been included in the economic growth target. And many want to know what kind of new policies will be issued this time around. Well, also anti-corruption has been talked over and over again. We remember the General Secretary of CPC Central Committee, Xi Jinping, has said during his lineup in the 18th Party Congress, he said the corruption has to be dealt with. Failure to do so will prove fatal not only to the party but also to the country. Well, tomorrow we'll see the official opening of the 12th.
Right, they are migrants, and if they are migrants, they cannot enjoy the privileges offered to those local people, like education, healthcare. You just mentioned all. And in Beijing, even housing. Right, so you have to live for 5 years to buy an apartment in Beijing. So all those kind of unequal treatments, that's what I think the new mode of urbanization is going to solve.
But do you think, did it make sense in the beginning of that system?
Well,
and does it still make sense now?
The system was introduced almost 60 years ago. I mean, in 1958. That was an extraordinary year. So it was almost a kind of an extraordinary policy introduced at that period of time. I mean, after 60 years, I don't think many people believe it's still necessary.
All right, you're now watching Voices and Votes, a special program on the nation's legislature and also political advisory body, our special coverage on the two sessions. Coming up next, just how serious is the wealth gap in China and how can it be tackled?
The CPPCC's various meetings are a platform for the CPPCC and its members to perform their political duties. During the meetings, CPPCC members make speeches, submit proposals, and vote on proposals. Away from the session for the rest of the year, members supervise the implementation of major national policies and oversee the planning and construction of large projects. They also closely monitor the actions of the government in dealing with major issues of public concern. CPPCC members work with the government's agenda and choose a special project to focus on. They raise opinions, interact with the public, evaluate the effectiveness of national policies, and feedback public concerns. The CPPCC plays a vital role in providing advice to the government, in democratic supervision, and in political consultation.
And news, we cover a broad range of issues on the changing China during the annual political season in Beijing starting March the 3rd. Laws and policies are deliberated freely at the plenum of the NPC and CPPCC. Real representation from across the Chinese social spectrum. You can't miss it here only on Voices and Votes. A new era for China, a new leadership and new policies that will impact a quarter of the world population. Our reporters will bring you the latest as China faces the political, economic and diplomatic challenges that will help shape a generation. That is political season in 2013 with Han Bing, Ai Yang, Hou Na, Guan Xin and Zhang Lili. Only on CCTV News. Senior reporter back at the annual NPC and CPPCC session.
I'm Zhou in Beijing. All in all, China is growing stronger and the Chinese are getting richer. But many problems remain unresolved. Is it possible to have both growth and fairness? Today, we will be looking at equality and justice.
And I'm Wang Mengmang. On the eve of the 12th National People's Congress session, we'll find out how the NPC's first spokeswoman dealt with some tough media questioning.
Hi, I am Terianne Chebet in Nairobi. Now, the developing continent of Africa has seen some of the world's widest income gaps. We'll tell you how Africa is coping with the situation and what experiences it can share with China.
Well, the 12th National People's Congress has given a press conference at the Great Hall of the People in the Chinese capital ahead of its first session. NPC spokeswoman Fu Ying took questions on the agenda of this year's session and the work of the NPC. Our reporter Hou Na has been following this, and now let's talk to her. Well, Hou Na, this year's NPC session is especially important as we are expected to see a new lineup of leadership. So what was the biggest issue there?
Good evening, Mang Mang. Well, we see the Vice Foreign Minister Fu Ying has made her debut as the NPC spokeswoman this morning. Well, that has actually surprised public because though she is the 7th NPC spokesperson, but she is the first NPC spokeswoman. Well, she has been answering questions ranging from various fields, and let's see how her diplomatic skills have helped her solving with questions regarding China's foreign policies.
The spokeswoman of the 12th NPC is no stranger to diplomacy. Vice Foreign Minister Fu Ying has also served as ambassador to Britain and Australia. No wonder she's confident when dealing with tough questions on foreign policy. A Japanese reporter asked whether China would continue to adopt what it calls a hard policy on territorial disputes. Fu Ying replied that in the eyes of many Chinese, the current policy is not hard enough.
When faced with provocations, many Chinese people think we should adopt a tougher stance. China always sticks to independent and peaceful diplomatic solutions. On the Diaoyu Islands dispute with Japan, I hope you can pass China's voice to Japanese people that we should stick to the historical facts.
Every year, reporters asked about the national defense budget. Fu Ying said China's peaceful foreign policy and defensive military policy are conducive to the security and peace of Asia.
A China with a stronger national defense will help maintain the peace in Asia as well as the world.
China's legislature, how important is that?
Well, because for quite a long time, we have this segment between the rural and the urban area, and this is becoming one of the major barriers for not only the social justice but also the sustainable economic growth. So now is the time that we address this issue. And I think this is the signal that shows that in the future there will be more reform concerning the hukou system and urbanization, and more reforms on the social safety network, the building of a social safety network.
So we have been talking about disparity between rural areas and urban areas. Does this policy signal anything of policy change in the future?
Well, this policy was announced actually last year. We changed our election law. But in terms of income disparity, I think the rural-urban divide is the largest in our country. It's very good to see that the new leadership is going to pay more attention to this issue. Urbanization is going to be very high on the agenda. That's going to be, in my own view, the only way out for China to solve the whole issue.
It seems that urbanization has become a vogue word for many government officials. What do you think the process of urbanization, where we are at right at the moment?
We are still at the midway, or we can say we are still at the very early stage, because previously, yes, we have this urbanization, but the much emphasis is on the urbanization of land. But as Li Keqiang mentioned, actually urbanization is about the population. So we are, in the future, we're moving more people from the rural area to the urban area.
And what is the major indicator that say, well, the urbanization is almost complete?
The most important indicator for urbanization will be the share of people living in the urban area to the whole population. But then a more tricky issue is how you count the people in the urbanization, because the current statistics, we count people living in the urban area for a certain period of time, like more than half a year. So you'll be counted as the citizens in the urban area. But actually, a lot of them are migrant workers, so they are living in the urban area, but then they do not have equal chance to get the welfare.
So they are only city dwellers, but they are not urban residents, because they have no equal treatment, although they live in the cities.
Yeah, I think this is mostly because of the hukou system. Right? The hukou divides people by, say, that they are local.
Household registration.
MPC, well, there have been discussions about institutional restructuring before and after the 18th Party Congress, and the two sessions will be the time to give the final verdict. Back to you, Mama.
Well, thank you so much, Hona, for that, and we'll be checking with you in the coming days. All right, now let's talk more about Fu Ying. The spokeswoman Fu Ying has been voted into the spotlight, the first female spokesperson for MPC sessions over the past 3 decades. She comes from an ethnic minority born in Inner Mongolia And she is described by some Western media as charming, steely, wary, and does not fit the stern face of most of Chinese officialdom. While Fu Ying has presented a more approachable air. For example, she apologized for being late because she was a newcomer to the Great Hall of the People and took more time in finding the correct way to the press briefing room. And also on environmental issues, she admitted that she has bought face masks for her daughter to tackle the heavy smog, and it's become her reflexive reaction every morning to see whether there is a blue sky. Well, Zhou Yue, even before this NPC officially started, the spokesperson had already started taking tough questions from media, and she answered questions on sensitive issues such as defense policy, the territorial disputes, and the environment. And she just has this winning and confident smile on her all the time.
Yes, indeed. She's a very veteran diplomat and very natural, articulate, and also ready to take on the new challenges. Of course, there's a lot of catching up to do for her. Thank you, Mama.
You're welcome.
Well, joining me here in the studio to talk about all the issues on Voices and Votes, Mr. He Fan, Deputy Director of the Institute of World Economics and Politics at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and also Mr. Yao Yang, Dean of the China Center of Economic Research at Peking University. Welcome, gentlemen. Well, this is a very important meeting, the first MPC and CPPC session after the CPC's 18th Congress. So what do you think are the major highlights? What is the eye-catching issues for you? Mr.
Well, I think in the past, the main theme for China is the high economic growth. In the past, we have put much emphasis on the GDP number, the growth number. And now we are at a very crucial point. And now we are moving from this high growth to a better quality growth. And in this debate, I think social justice and the income distribution will become one of the most heated debated topic.
And for you, Mr. Yao?
Well, first, of course, we need to pay attention to the leadership transition. That's a big event, both conferences. And talk about the future, I think the environmental issue will be very high on the agenda, and the income distribution, and also I think population policy, and also financial sector reform. I think they are going to be mentioned by those delegates.
And there's one interesting thing that we should take notice is that for the first time, those people living in the countryside and in the cities will be equally represented at the